that's really the point I want to highlight in this video. This video has shown that the Levant and Anatolia was the place where Neolithic society began after the Younger Dryas, and with Göbekli Tepe only around 250 kilometers north of the Syrian impact site, well, I was surprised that the Fertile Crescent was the birth of Neolithic civilization after experiencing such an event, an area that was directed by the Younger Dryas. But after a little research, it really shouldn't be a surprise. I'll explain why shortly. This study into the Abu Huraira impact event came to light from researching the Natufian culture, a people that lived through the Younger Dryas in the Near and Middle East. Here is a map of the area they occupied between 14,000 and 11,500 years ago. And, as you can see, the impact location of Abu Huraira is within their known geographical limits, marking the northern extent of their occupation in the region. The Natufian were the ancestors of the first farmers of the Levant and Anatolia, a people that are likely the ancestors of those that built Göbekli Tepe, which has an oldest people likely the ancestors of those that in the region. The Natufian were the ancestors of the first farmers of the Levant and Anatolia, a people that are likely the ancestors of those that built Göbekli Tepe, which has an oldest radiocarbon date of 11,130 and 10,800 years ago. Göbekli Tepe could have been even older though, and stonework could have even started during the Younger Dryas by the Natufians, or maybe a close neighbour. Genetic studies show that the ancient Anatolians and Levantians do relate back to the Natufian culture. So, look at the Natufians is important in our quest to find out about the earliest ancestors of some of the incredible ancient civilizations which they ultimately gave birth to.
Alright, so I'm going to put a link in the chat real fast. I'm going to let this video play a little longer, and then we're going to have a conversation. Alright, let me just do this. I don't know what happened, just logged out real fast. Alright.
The 1,500-year-old Natufian site in Jordan that shows evidence of bread baking. There is.
Alright, so I found an interesting video that I was just scrolling along as I like to deep studies on ancient history, and as you know, one of our favorite little history to go over is the Natufian, right? The earliest culture of the Levantan culture, not the earliest, most earliest. We'll talk about that. What's the most earliest? But is a mid culture in the Levant that replaces the culture that's in the Levant and becomes the first Semitic culture. It actually rises up to become a Semitic culture. But also, what's interesting about it is very controversial. Let me point out a little interesting video that I found right here. This is a little 1 minute little video right here. This is what we're going to be reviewing today. The reason why we're going to be reviewing this today is because comments. That's
the original.
I'll just play the video and then we'll talk about some things in the comments.
Who were the Natufians? The Natufians were the original inhabitants of the Middle East. They lived in countries like Israel, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Turkey, and are known to be the inventor of agriculture 12,000 years ago. That invention triggered the first civilizations in all these areas. They are also the first people to make bread. Several biologists like Ecclesiastes and And Roland studies. They found out that the indigenous people from the Middle East had Y chromosomes of African origin, and that they didn't experience Neanderthal admixture. It made them different from all other later populations in the Levant. In other words, they were black African explorers who settled in the area after the last ice age. Their haplogroup, E1B1, is the main haplogroup inside the African continent today. In its original form, it's almost exclusively found among black African populations from countries such as Ghana, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Senegal, South Africa, Gambia, Cameroon, Tanzania, and even among some African Americans. So, we can that Africans invent
All right, so that's
Natufian.
something that's interesting about this. This is something that's really interesting. Of Natufian, right? So the Natufian have a lot of things to talk. Now, what's interesting is a lot of times I don't know much about this person's page, and I don't know anything else that he's talking about and everything, and whatnot. But there's a lot of misinformation, right? Some people say the Natufian didn't invent agriculture, right? We know the Natufian did invent agriculture, right? That was what that video we were just talking about was talking about. That we would talk about some of the things of the Natufian. They also had dogs, right? They also It's also important to know something about their women, right? They had an interesting mix with their women, right? They actually mix with a type of, in a way, some Indo-European women, but there also are those rare sister lineages of the Natufian, which those L lineages, which early on they get with these M and N lineages early on before they get with those L's, but those L's start off as being related to them. But we know that a lot of those Natufians are going to have some very interesting traits. Let me play another video that will also connect with this. So let me play this real fast.
This is a fascinating article that talks about Natufian sites where lime plaster may have been used, including a couple that are much older than Anatolian. It talks about, here is a diagram where these materials were found. This is a fascinating article that talks about other Natufian sites where lime plaster may have been used, including a couple that are much older than Anatolian. It talks about Yiftahel, a site I covered about a year ago. But it says the Natufian culture is recognized as important during the dynamic turnover in human evolution to food-producing cultures in the southern Levant. It is of special interest not only because cultural changes that emerge as human populations become more permanently settled, but also because it set the stage for the fundamental transition to agriculturally based societies. And that really was spread all over the area 12,000 years ago, the switch to agriculture and raising animals. It says many important trajectories of social change that begin in the Natufian, including permanent settlement infrastructure, heightened symbolic communication, and ritual practice, and the concentration, burial of human remains and settlements extend into the Neolithic. But this is a fascinating article, and here it gives a look at these burials where the lime plaster is used. It says the burials where the lime settlements.
Why is this important? Good understanding for the review. This is also for the sake of some understanding on this information that yes, it is true that when the Natufian got there, they released a culture that was there. They also introduced agriculture. They also started to later on in the pre-pottery Neolithic, as it says right here, until the Neolithic period. In the pre-pottery Neolithic, they switched to pastoralism because a lot of those pastoralists had moved those animals down into the areas of Africa and other places, right? There used to be a lot of different creatures around, right? For example, this one talks about, hippos and things like that, a couple different things, whatnot. But this might be basically telling us a little information to understand that yes, it is important that the resulting changes reflect the increasing difference different use of space and a rise of basically, long story short, agriculture, right? So it is true that the Natufians had rose up agriculture, right? They had entered into the place, replaced the culture, changed the style of culture to an agriculturalist. Those agriculturalists were also, it's important to know, during their time they weren't that much pastoralist because it was filled with a lot of animals. By the time they hunted the gazelle to extinction, almost extinction, we know that the Natufians switched to pastoralism, right, to manage the animals, right, to manage more animal management, right. We also know Natufian was great with animals, right. We know that prior to Israel, right, we got to remember there was no law of Moses prior to that. The Natufian They were herding all types of different animals, right? All types of different animals, right? Because we know before Terra, we know that most of the nations were idol worshippers. Almost all of them were idol worshippers and everything. But we do know that agriculture had rose from this culture. We do know that it's supposed to be a said culture that is going to be your E groups. Now, they say the E group is African, but this is what's interesting about this. The Natufians actually show us the oldest evidence of these lines. The Natufians actually show us the oldest evidence of these lines. Actually, on our first illustration of the Natufian right here, we actually got, I guess this was a very, very deep dive. Let me just open this up and point something out here. So just a different information of the Natufian. The Natufian samples consisted of 61.2% Arabian, 21.2% North African, 10.9% Western Asian, right? Got the mtDNA mix, and 6.8% omic. So that's important to know about the omic finds, right? Omic, right? We spoke about it before. How do we know? Why is it important? Because if you look up omic or the omic language, you know that the groups that were connected to it are going to be mainly E groups, especially E1B1 A and E1B1, or basically E1B1A2 that we see that's connected with that, and some E1B1B. The transition in the Levant from the Epo-Paleolithic to the Neolithic, to that pre-pottery Neolithic B period, involved an increase of Arabian ancestry. So that means this line became Arabian. Now, I was doing some study on some SNPs, a couple of different SNPs, a lot of different SNPs and everything, and I found that this family does have a lot of ties to Arabia, early ties to Arabia. Different lines have ties to Arabia. In fact, there's some SNPs, but it was a reanalysis they had to do of the genome sequence of the data from 279 ancient Eurasian. That's very important. So it reveals, obviously, basically some ties, right? So they talk about a lot of ones. So let's get back over here. And so back to what we was talking, summary, and then back to the finish. All right. So what we were just doing is that we did a quick summary of what's the Natufian. We know that they had animals, a lot of animals with them. They was animal lovers, right? They began as pastoralists, right? They began as when I say began, let me actually rephrase it. Not began as pastoralists. Let me quote that better than that. They began and introduced agriculturalists. Agriculturalism was brought in by the Natufian. Now, the Natufian were not the first ones in the Levant. That's important because a lot of people, they try to conclude that they are, because they're the oldest in the Levant, they try to say they must be Canaan. But that's not true. We got to be careful on that idea, because actually it's older people than the Natufian. Modern humans that are older in the Levant than the Natufian. But that was important to understand, that have ties to some of the Semitic culture, later the Semitic cultures, things of that sort. Now, let me just read some highlights here, right? This model would imply that both the CF and the DE YAP evolved nearby but outside Africa, right? Because we got those earliest DNA groups in the areas of the Levant. One DE YAP ancestor would have spread to Asia. So we know that because we have no doubt the D group went into Asia. We also know those Natufians and everything, and evolved to D, while another D YAP returned to Northeast Africa and evolved into haplogroup E. It is noteworthy that DE YAP has been detected in Africa. So let's get a good understanding on some things. Where did they split? So we're gonna get a little from 2021. Genomic history of the haplogroup common in Natufian E1B1 is so frequent in our database. With most lineages, when you hear Natufian, they usually talk about, about 11,000 BC or 10,000 BC, right? So when they say 8,000 to 9,000 KYA, right, that's years back. So take 2,000 off of that, or add 2,000 to that to bring it to BC. And we will see that would be about Natufians about 11, 10,000 BC. So they usually say it's 11, 10,000 BC, right? We already know the years exaggerated. They're counted by the layers, right? But it's important to understand this by the scientific method so we can get a good understanding on the scale of it all. So it says though we found, now this is what's important too. I want to make sure I mention this. This is very important, that we actually know without a doubt that we found fossils of older Natufians than the normal Natufians. There's Natufians that are about 10,000 and all that, but we did find a 40,000 year old Natufian, right? And that's what this is talking about too. Though we found a rare, deeply divergent Y chromosome, which correlates basically 39,000 KYA, right? 39,000 years ago. Very, very important, right? We already know the Middle Eastern haplogroups, D&E, split 42,000 years. Saying these years are very high. First people that settled in the Levant, right? Nope, they're not the first. They actually would be in the Levant. Lines in the Levant. Look at this early line in Europe. Look how early this group will be in Europe. That'd be a very early line in the areas of Europe. But let me go back a little bit so you can see right here. This will be an earlier line in the Levant. But did you know we also had earlier humans in the Levant before Natufians? There were earlier humans in the Levant before the Natufians. For example, this one. Manat, how you say that? Manat was actually basically an Arctic modern human. So he would be actually a early modern human that would actually be about 50 scale. We actually know it would be a modern human. We also know that this, unlike the Natufian, this human mixed with Neanderthals. We actually know that this one actually was one that had went into this area and mixed with the. Now, most likely, since it mixed with the Neanderthals, who do we see with Neanderthal mix? The CF lineages, right? Sons of Japheth. And we also know that that early line that mixed with the Neanderthal is found in the IJK groups, right? You can find it in Y-DNA I, Y-DNA K, Y-DNA J. They're all going to be the same because at their root they mixed, so they're going to have an early mix, right? It's kind of like when you think about lines like, for example, I'll later with some things. I want to point out some things. Let me point out this little monophylactic family fast. So before I move forward, there's three major early splits of the families. There's your A and B groups, which are different. There's your D&E groups, which have a YAP group. That's important. They're different. And then you're going to have your CF groups, which becomes your more European lineages and things like that, of that sort. They're also different. So that's going to be very important. All right. Shalom, family. Shalom. All right, back into it. So you can see right here, obviously this will be the earliest human. There's a good understanding of that, right? This is going to be some very early finds. If we go a little more deep into this person, we actually can know that we can get a little understanding about this, that fossil reveals a distinctive bun shape at the back of the person's head. So they got some understanding of it. This shape resembles recent African, and ancient European skulls. So it's letting us know that the skull looks like ancient Indo-Europeans, like recent Africans, right? So it could be an A group because we know A and B, A groups went into the area of Europe really early, right? So it could be the original sons of Ham, but differs from modern humans from the Levant. So it differs from modern humans of the Levant. That means that we got to note that if we're getting a good understanding of who's in the Levant now versus who was in it before, right? We're getting a good understanding in the position. It's even letting us know, since we know E1B1B is still in the modern people of the Levant, as we see, we know that the people was replaced. So this line that I'm showing here, this one that's said to be it would have got replaced. It's important. So it's letting us know that it differs from modern people of the Levant, right? So it's not Natufian, right? The Eastern Mediterranean region, that the ancient not people, right? That ancient be closely related first modern humans that colonized Europe. So again, a good understanding that there were some earlier peoples, and that's important to know that that's why we have to note the Natufian, because when they enter the picture, they're the early, stretching up to 39,000, and they replace the culture that's there based on their time scale. right? We can also do a comparison of other ancient humans that they say they found in Africa. They say 60 to 90,000 years ago. This skull right here, and they compare that skull to that skull, and they say, are they related? Are they connected? Right. This one is more. I'm gonna go back so that we can get back a little more into the Natufian. I just want to let you know that they do know that the Neanderthal mixture of a ancient human that was in that area a long ago, but was replaced by a Natufian that was a agriculturalist culture that later became pastoralists, right? From the said latest time of this E group to their Neolithic, especially Neolithic. So it's very important. So I just want that and go back. And again, this is about, let me go down here, right? So a lot of good information on the Natufians that is important. But when I seen this little 1 minute video, it's just, there's just so many people that are misinformed. Like they're just a lot of people that's misinformed. And what is a Natufian and what's the history behind the Natufian? And if they actually were the starters of the culture and things like that. So I just seen a lot of comments misinformed on this and whatnot. So it's very important to give that clarity. Let me make sure I proceed to what else we have missed real fast. Show this part. I don't know if this got shown. Let me make sure I show it.
Here is a diagram where these plastered burials were found. This is an article that talks about Natufian sites. Other Natufian.
In fact, I think on here, yes, I will leave this alone because I did show it. But let me show this last part right here. This is the last piece I want to show here. So I just want to do a quick summary on the Natufian. I got cut out on a part in the middle here, the video we're doing. Let me show a little piece on this one right now.
Meet Arik Haglili, the tour guide of ariktoursinisrael.com. Arik Haglili has been a private tour guide in Israel for over 15 years. He holds a master's degree in Land of Israel Studies, and he's an expert in archaeology and the philosophy of religion. Over the last 15 years, as a private tour guide in Israel, Arik has had the privilege of guiding a variety of clients, including large groups and extended families, among them distinguished guests. Arik, privatoursinisrael.com. Hope you enjoy this video.
Hey guys, this is Eric from privatoursinisrael.com. Today I want to talk about this cool looking skeleton. This woman, it was actually a woman that was buried with her dog, was actually in And, a very famous archaeological site dated to the final old Stone Age. That was in the transition from foraging to farming. Built in circa 8,000 BCE. The settlement is an example of hunter-gatherer sedentism. That was a crucial step in the transition from foraging to farming. And has one of the earliest known archaeological evidence of dog domestication. The Natufian village of And was located 25 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee and is in an area surrounded by hills and located by an ancient lake. Today, the remains of that lake is Lake Ahula up north, 100 BCE.
All right, I'll drop these in the description if you want to see these videos more. But we were just talking about all these things. Notice how a lot of people these are very important. These are very important pieces of information to know about, because this actually reveals a deep history to a culture that few people actually know about. And let me show this because this probably dropped out because I was revealing an empty snip that I found. Never went to Africa, pretty much. It's a snip of basically the reason why it is important because we know that the Natufian, there's 6% of the Natufian that's E1B1 that makes the said quote unquote omic line. and like I had before, right? That's different ways you can go about that and find it. Let me just show it, right? And we mostly touch on methodology or get in the method for how we're going about these things, giving the sources, things for that, whatnot. Just point out something here, or rather, let's just go to it like this. I'll just go to it here. Oh, I can kind of show that, or so I can show this. So just you can go to Omic. You can find it anywhere and whatnot. I'll just go to the simple route about it. So I went to Omic. You want to go to like where it says Omic people and stuff to get the understanding on them and everything. You could put Omic. I'm pretty sure if I put Omic, you'll find it like that. Probably would have been the easier. Sometimes it goes. I'll just go to people. Omic people. Just put Omic people. I'm pretty sure it'll pop up. This one's just giving me the language and stuff. But if I just go to, I say, let me go to M because it's probably easier to find like this. DNA. Right? Because it find the information about the omics and stuff like whatnot. If I go to V38, right, you'll see some interesting splits and everything. Talk about the changes, right? You got E1B1A1, right? That's going to reveal to you the fact about the omics, right? As it says right here, this haplogroup is frequent in Southwest Ethiopia, and that's what we spoke about. That if you look at the Hebrew, right? If you want to find the Hebrews and stuff like that, you got to find out their linguistic family. The Southern Semitic is the closest to Hebrew. That's important. And it says especially among Omic speaking people. So Natufians, again, like we've seen with the information, right? We have seen before already. We've seen that the Natufians, right, are a very important culture, but it goes deep into who they are, their mixture and stuff like that. We take a look. We can see that the Natufian, right, they have 60 or 6.8% omic. So you can see what's going on there. So you get a nice portion. We know that E1B1A1 and E1B1A2 is obviously going to have some connections, as it says, especially among omic speaking populations, right? Very, very important. Now, the reason why is because there's a SNP of M2 that never been in Africa. In fact, if we take a look at this whole SNP, we can see it in Oman. We can see it in the United Arab Emirates. And this is what we can see. If we look at a map, we can see that it doesn't even have any connections to Africa. It has no connections to Africa because none of these SNPs has ever been found in Africa. They have only been found in the areas of, as you can see, in the area at this corner here of Arabia. So upper corner here in Saudi Arabia, and you can see in Oman and the United or the UAE. So that's very important because that's kind of interesting to note of a mutation of some of these lines that some of them never actually even been into the lands of Africa. The reason why I'm saying that because obviously E1B1B has some early settlements in some of the upper areas, but also E1B1A has some interesting movements as well that also settles in some of these areas. If we look at something like this is just an early SNP. This one I'm gonna leave alone. I'm gonna get back over here to point out more than the Natufians. So the Natufian, what really makes those lines is that E1B1. Let me make sure I on this right. The Natufian, right, has an E1B1, right, with an mtDNA of H with an E1B1, right? That's important that we actually note that that line is going to make a lot of different family lines. So the earliest SNPs in that area, we can definitely get a full understanding of what's going on there. So usually Natufians have E1B1B, but we do know that they have an E1B1A that makes, an E1B1 that makes E1B1A. So that's very important. Again, they are the ones that started agriculture, right? They replaced another culture and then they started agriculture. And when they started agriculture, they later in the Neolithic, right, as it says right here, again, into the Neolithic, that's when they actually switched to changing from agriculture, right, to pastoralism. So that's very important. It's very important because they basically did the gazelle to extinction. That's what they did. They hunted the gazelle to extinction. So I'll put these in the description. So just a quick little summary today. I'm just going to summarize, right? And I'll touch on here. And yeah, we have some fossils in Egypt. I'm going to let this open up. Just let it open up real fast because I had it open earlier, but I had to restart. All right. Let me go to something real fast for Egypt. Yes, we have a couple fossils in Egypt. Make sure I look at that question across any skeletons found in Egypt where Israel supposedly had lived. So now you wanna think about skulls and of Avaris, right? Because they'll say Avaris is where the Hebrews settled, where the Semitic groups are at. So you find them during about Bronze Age to about the said Iron Age, right? At the transition of the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. That's what you want to find. You want to find E1B1A in Africa, in Egypt, in that time frame. You want to find E1B1A in Africa and in Egypt about Bronze Age, Iron Age. That's what you want to find for them if they're going to qualify as Israelites. That they have to be in not just Africa. They can't be in the lower areas of Africa. Now they could be spread there, but we got to find them mostly in the lands of Egypt. And guess what? If you look at a study by Dr. Nathan Jensen and many others, they know that E1B1A flooded the area of Egypt at about that time. And that's very important to know. But let me actually point something out real fast. So, I don't really. We already know the oldest. Let me just show you the old first, so you understand who's the older Egyptians, the original Egyptians, who's the older Egyptians. Right? There's a couple different papers that talk about it. We had talked about this before. That the MB groups, as you can see, these black lines right here, these will be the older Egyptians. We can also note that on some different papers that actually spout this. Right? You got to also note that have, and one of the leads that we want to note at that time that enters in the frame right after the time of the Exodus, after the time of leaving the wilderness, is Ramses, not Ramses II. Ramses II, they say, is the pharaoh of the Exodus, but Ramses III is after the Exodus. So we know that is a curse on Ramses II. If you know, almost all his sons die. Right? That's a curse. Remember the curse in the Bible is your firstborn son won't sit on the throne and all that whatnot. How he says that, the way that he says that, right? You kill the firstborn. And we know that a lot of Ramses' sons died. And we know that by the time of Ramses the third, now 40 years later, none of Ramses' sons are basically on the position of the throne. But here's the oldest ones that was in the lands of what's the word I'm looking for? In the lands of Egypt. This will be the oldest one, and I'll show you the source real fast that we're going to be reading from. Just to show you this, this gonna be in this piece of land here. As you know, this is because you asked a complex question. Egypt was actually a divided nation, right? It was Upper and Lower Egypt and everything. So that's something also to note. But here's a read from it that we know the oldest ones. Pretty much the oldest people that was in that land were actually, long story short, AM13 bearers. That they were the first one. A groups will be the earliest Hamitic lines. So that's important to understand if we're considering in that understanding of the biblical narrative who was first there, right? That would be your A-M13. That would be your earliest ones there. Now, if we want to look for when they enter into frame about the Israelite time frame, again, that's going to be looking at some of those finds. So this is just that one that's talk about those people in Sudan, just to show that. But E1B1A right? If you got to look carefully with them at the time they come in, right? They'll come in about the Bronze Age, Iron Age. So they'll enter in about the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then they'll settle in the area of pretty much the area of the Levant. Best source, I think, the couple different finds, and also Ramsey III, right? His story, if you know, a lot of people, they can connect them to Syria, things like that. It's a lot of interesting connections, right? He's one of the few that gets on the throne with his haplogroup, right? That's a new that gets on that throne, right? Ramsey III, you can't find an earlier man with his haplogroup on that throne of Egypt, on the throne of Egypt, and that's a great sign. That's a great sign once you get a new, right? Because we can look at the older pharaohs. Let me go to one with the pharaohs. The older pharaohs right before the Exodus had R groups. Some had G groups. Spoke before that Ramses II might have a J group because we had connected his father and a couple things like that. But let's look at a paper. Let's take a real quick look at this paper here, just kind of get an idea. So about 12 BC, that's what you want to find, something about 12 BC. And about 12 BC, you find E1B1A. So Israelite time frame, transition, about that time frame, we do find E1B1A at that time. So obviously you got Ramses, yes, but we also got some of his other connections, right? Earlier connections, other sons that got on that throne, right? So that was a transfer of power that happened. If we look at who was previously on the throne, right, we can take a look at some of the groups that were separate or different on the throne. As we can see right here again, some of the other emperors, right, Moses and Amenhotep and all those jazz and whatnot, they was about the same family. But then all of a sudden, a transition changed about the time of after Ramses II into Ramses III. That was a transition, and someone hopped on the throne. All of a sudden, this new line popped up out of nowhere, right? These fossils got on the throne, but they was not on the throne before, right? That's very important. But we know that they was there, they was around, right? We know that they was around, and we still know that. What's the word I'm looking for? We still also know. Let me go to one more picture here, just one more to kind of bring it home. We also know that if we look carefully at some of the groups, let me just go down. I'll do a summary. Let me go to. I'll show you a quick video. You probably know just by me saying this. Answers in Genesis, Dr. Nathan Jensen points out that he says that E1B1A was around that area. And we do know E1B1A was around that area because all of a sudden the transition of the king's power, right? There's no way that this family was related to the previous lines that were there because we know that R ruled there. We know that without a doubt. There's no debate on if R groups ruled the throne of Egypt. Then all of a sudden, at the Israelite time frame, we get these almost E1B1As jumping on the throne, right? Where did they come from? Why did they enter the throne? What happened? What happened to Egypt and the time of the Exodus and his sons that his family didn't get on the throne, but another family got on the throne that was around that area, right? This family that was around that area got on the throne. So we do have evidence of that will be the evidence, basically. That line being the land of Egypt. So that'll be Egypt coming out. We can also connect them early in coming out of the land of Egypt into like the Linkish inscriptions. We got a couple different evidence of a couple different things. But for the answer of Egypt, yes, we can prove that this line would be in that area, around that perimeter, having the ability to, yes, possibly being having connections to that group that's surpassed the Egyptians real fast. At that time, very important. So we know that there was a power. That's why they spoke about it. That the earliest ones were A groups there, right? Not E groups, but A groups. That's important to understand. That A groups ruled the throne before your F-M89 sons got there, right? Like R, right? Where is it? Just to read it one time. So you can see right here, researchers had looked at those. Transition from the Neolithic in that area and whatnot. And this is what they know what happened there when they was comparing the Mesoretic, post-Mesoretic, the Christian later, all those later periods. And this is what they found out. Most of the Kodarak individuals were haplogroup AM13 bearers, right? But then later on, the Mesoretic, post-Mesoretic, and Christian era samples were instead, so here's mainly haplogroup E, haplogroup YAP, including which includes your D-M174 and all the branches of E-M96, and haplogroup F-M89 carriers. Like I spoke of, F-M89 makes your GHIJK, HIJK, IJK, all the way down to K, down to P, down to R, which is a brother of Q, right? Big major family from F-M89. But that's who replaced the throne. So R got on the throne first, and then after the reigns of Tutmosis and all that, then you get the Pharaoh that is Ramses. And remember, you're going to get Seti the first, then you get his lines and all that and whatnot. But then Ramses the second, obviously being from Ramses the first, right? And Seti the first. Ramses the second, who is not related to Ramses the third, right? This is very important. I made sure with an Egyptologist that there's no doubt that Ramses the third has no connections to Ramses the second, right? Very important. Ramses the second hit the throne, and it was said to him that his family would be cut off, right? And then all of a sudden, right after that transition, right, you can count it, 40 years later after the Exodus, boom, that was all of a sudden this new line entering the throne. Wasn't it interesting that Israel always wanted to flee back to Egypt, right? Maybe they knew something more that maybe we didn't know, right? Remember, they're living in it. We're getting a summary of the context, right? We're getting a summary of it, but enough to understand these things. So we know that all of a sudden change of the family lines, and then all of a sudden this E line jumps on the throne, and it wasn't the original ones that was there. So very important stuff. You can see Nathan try to pull off and say that they were Egyptian, but we know they weren't Egyptian, but they were in Egypt. The E groups will be in Egypt. So very important. But we know that they came from somewhere else. They have ties to the Natufian. So just wanted to answer that with enough detail to get a good understanding of that. Isn't that right? And the reason why they didn't find none in Avaris, because they didn't find in Avaris. Because it's not easy to find stuff in a land that is pretty much filled with sand. And a lot of other destructions that happened there. Egypt was one of the most invaded areas, right? Think about it. Think about Egypt early on, right? All the different dynasties, right? There's dynasties, like 20 dynasty and all this dynasty and that. And then you get the change of the Ptolemaic kingdom when the Greeks come there. Then you get the change of the Christians coming there. Then you get the change of the Islamic coming there. And when Islam comes there, they destroy a bunch of stuff. They destroy libraries. They destroy a bunch of stuff. A lot of things are destroyed. So that's important to know, that just because we don't find them pinpoint in one area, that doesn't change that they are actually going to have ties again to ancient pastoralists that came from ancient agriculturalists that lived in the areas around the Levant and in the Levant and Syria and stuff like that. So just to get a good understanding that because we know that original Egyptians were A groups, the transition of that time frame is that in the pinpoint transition of that time frame. If E, instead of Tutmosis and Amenhotep being R, if that was E, I have nothing to say. I can say, well, E already showed itself being on the throne before. E1B1A was on the throne before, right? But it wasn't. It was R, it was G, it was J, it was other groups that was there, especially A. Then all of a sudden, exactly at the said time frame after the said Exodus Pharaoh, we get that E1B1A jumping on the throne after the time of that wilderness time frame. So very, very interesting stuff, especially after the scripture where it says that the son of that Pharaoh, his son won't sit on the throne. So Ramses II, he's wiped out. Later on, 40 years later, Ramses III jumps on the throne. New line. That's evidence of that line being in that area. So that's an example of that. That's that detailed. So let's do a quick summary real fast. And while I'm doing the summary, if you got any more questions, throw those out there. We get more detail in that topic, or we can get a little more into something a little different. But let me just give a summary. So what did we touch today? We went over the evidence that the Natufians lived in the area of Syria. All right. I got a little meeting real fast. But I'm gonna end it like that. You can re-see it. I'll do a summary of this again. With that, family, appointment today. I'll be back a little later. I want to pause it, but I probably can't. Actually, I can't pause it. I'm gonna play a little something, maybe see if it takes too long.
Heavier that was start directly affected by the younger. But after a little research, it really surprised. I'll explain why shortly. This study into the Abu Huraira impact events came to light from researching the Natufian culture, a people that lived through the Younger Dryas in the Near and Middle East. Here is a map of the area they occupied between 14,000 and 11,000 years ago, and as you can see, the impact location of Abu Huraira is within their known geographical limits, marking the northern extent of their occupation. 11,130 and 10,800 years ago. Göbekli Tepe could have been stonework could have even been Dryas by the Natufians, or maybe a close neighbour.
I'm still alive because I wanted to do a summary real fast, but appointment. But I'm gonna try to wrap this up so we can get a summary of these things. So you saw what I showed real fast. So it lets you know again, agriculture came from the Natufians that replaced the culture that was there. It has high portions or a high possibility of being Shemites. We also know that that culture that replaced the culture that was there. We also know that that same culture later became pastoralist during the pre-pottery Neolithic. We know that that same culture also was very used to taking care of animals, right? It was very fond of animals. We actually found some with dogs and different things like that. They tamed animals, right? So they had high possibility of becoming pastoralists. That's very important with the ability of taming animals, right? So we got a good understanding of a couple of different of those things. We also did a quick review on some information as people talk about Natufian is very interesting. I think the Natufian is something that's worth talking about. This was an interesting summary.
Who were the
I'm gonna
Natufians?
play real fast, and I'm gonna point.
The Natufian, the original inhabitants of the Middle East. They lived in countries like Israel, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Turkey, and are known to be the inventors of agriculture 12,500 years ago. That invention triggered the development of first civilizations in all these areas. They are also the first people to make bread. Several biologists like Yusuf Lazaridis and bodies. They found that the indigenous people from the Middle East had Y chromosomes of African origin and that they didn't experience Neanderthal admixture. It made them different from all other later nations in the Levant. In other words, the African explorers who settled an area after the last ice age. Their haplogroup, E1B1, is the main haplogroup inside the African continent today. In its original form, it's almost exclusively found among black African populations from countries such as Ghana, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Senegal, South Africa, Gambia, Cameroon, Tanzania, and even among some African Americans. So, we can say that Africans invented agriculture.
So yeah, everything's good. I'm not going to bother doing the smoke detector because he's a...
Genetics show that the ancient Anatolians and Levantians do relate back to the Natufian culture. So,
all right, so we know ancient Levantins do have connections to Natufian being connection, right? Very, very important. So let's summarize what we're finna do. So I had a little bit real fast. I gotta summarize it now. So the Natufian are very ancient, but they're not the earliest modern human in the Levant. That's very important. They replaced a lineage of groups of modern humans that had some mixes of Neanderthals. That's very important. They have replaced that culture that was there. That's very, very, very important. And by the time they get there, they are going to be a culture that's going to be basically introducing agriculturalist methods. They're going to be introducing that agriculture, and they're also going to be later, again, in the Neolithic time frame, becoming pastoralism. We had spoke about them being Semitic and a couple different things like that. We got a lot of sources for them being Semitic and things like of that sort and everything. Right? You can see some of the ages, they keep going up and up because some of the fossils are questionable because they keep finding them in different layers, right? They keep finding these fossils in different layers. But this is actually important information. So I just want to show that. I also had some information about some SNPs, about some things later. I'll separate the video, but I'm gonna point out what SNPs and what group of E1B1 I believe to be actually the Israelites, right? Is actually gonna be kind of pinpoint in a way. So, and like I said, there are some SNPs of E1B1 or M2 that never went into Africa. They never went into Africa, but they have higher portions in the lands of basically Arabia. Right, we have a lot of that. The information that's important to know with some of these SNPs that go fairly deep into who they are and things like that. So I'll go over later another time because I was going over it today, but different things happen. But that family, I'm gonna do one more because I feel like I summarized it fully. Today we were doing a review on a very short video that through the comments. You might see me there. Right, my name's Demetrius Booker. That's my name. Right, I want you to know that, and I want you to understand that I'll be around speaking the truth, different sources as I go. But I wanted to show you about the Natufian. I'm slowly, and as many others are also trying to get the whole world to recognize this ancient culture, which already realize is a real culture. Illustrate this culture, this group of people that they say is only African, that they're not actually only African, right? That they actually have some ties to other places, that they actually have some history in other places, that it brings together the whole story, the whole tale of where they came from, how they developed, and how these pastoralists became the said Semitic groups that later became part of the written texts of different Abrahamic religions and things like that, especially the Jewish religion and the lead to time. So with that, again, Natufians are not the oldest in the Levant, not the oldest modern human in the Levant, but they do replace the humans in the Levant when they get there about close to about 40,000 years ago, right? And that's their time frame. But they thrive, they increase and thrive about 10,000 BC. That's important because we got a 49,000 piece of information about the Natufian. Oh, not 49, 39,000 about the Natufian. But again, the Levant gets very old. As you can see, in fact, if we wanted to, we can break down the whole chain until the time of the rise of the Natufian, when the Natufian comes in, right? What time frame they actually come into the Levant. Actually, they're not the first, but they are the first agriculturalists who become pastoralists. That's who the Natufian are. So I'll put this stuff in the description if you want to get a little more deeper into it. With that, may you be blessed. May you be beloved.